The following is a real recording of a real coaching session. If you're interested in getting some coaching yourself, you can find the link in the description. Thanks and enjoy the video. So how's things this week?
Yeah, good. Got stacked twice in two hands last night. That was fine.
That's rough. Yeah. But as long as you think you made the good decisions, that's all we can hope for, right?
Yeah, just got it in Kings versus Ace 10 and then Ace King versus Ace King.
That's definitely pretty rough, but hopefully the luck will turn around soon. So in terms of continuing with the plan that we had, the next sort of thing that I think would be on the agenda from the list of stuff that we came up with is to just do a bit of a review of some principles that we're going to keep in mind for multi-way spots. Since I know you mentioned that there's quite a lot of multi-way spots going on in the games that you're playing in. To start with, before we dive into looking at some of the slides and visuals and stuff that I have, talk me through how you tend to approach multi-way type situations right now. And is there any sort of specific studying that you've done on this point or on this sort of topic up to this point?
Yeah, so I have watched your Theory and Chaos videos of
Cool.
both of them. And
Nice.
I don't know, I guess I just sort of base it off of that. But I did find maths a bit hard, but I can get the hang of it. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I want to keep it fairly big picture. Obviously, there's a lot of detail in some of the specifics, and a lot of what I included in those videos was just basically just designed as proof for some of the things that I'm saying. So I'm saying like this
Yeah.
there is more important than this one or whatever, and we just got to back that up with some kind of numbers. Just to kick off today, I want to go through kind of summarizing some of the stuff from that course. It's in different form because I got different slides for it now, but really it's just summarizing the taking everything we got from that course and just boiling it down to a few kind of basic ideas. The stuff that I studied here is obviously the impact of things like SPR, position, board texture, large bet sizes, things like that. And the general principles that we're going to keep in mind are going to be that higher SPR is going to mean that the in position player gets to play a bit more aggressively because they're able to leverage that SPR, that positional advantage against multiple players across multiple streets, where when we're heads up, because the stack off thresholds narrow up when we're deeper, we often actually have to play a little bit less aggressively at deeper stacks in heads up spots. And then we've got number of players left to act behind is more important than the number in front. So being fourth to act out of 6 players is roughly the same as being second of 4 and so on. So that's obviously important. Higher card board textures are still going to allow the first place range or the strongest range to use their nut advantage, utilize their nut advantage, particularly when the board is rainbow and unpaired. And larger bet sizes can and do occur in certain situations, but they require some kind of asymmetry in ranges. It has to be a spot where there's a certain category of hand that we can have at a pretty high frequency that the collective group of our opponents is unlikely to have. So that might be it's ace king X and we can have ace king and they can't, or anything like that. Or it could be that particularly one really useful thing to look out for that I've picked up from a lot of the spots that I've looked at since I put out the courses is that if you can identify a board texture where none of your opponents can have any of the offsuit 2 pair, that's usually a pretty good indicator that a lot of your best 1 pair hands are going to be able to justify putting in a decent chunk of chips. So if you think about, like, a good example is those disconnected lower card board type situations where if it's 10-7-3 rainbow, great example of a spot where pretty much nobody's going to have an offsuit 2 pair there, right? Or at least pretty rare that anyone's going to have 10-7 off, 7-3 off, or 10-3 off in range. So our overpairs on that board are immediately a lot more happy to use some larger bet sizes, even against multiple players. Because even though there's players out there flopping a set sometimes, it simply is very hard to flop a set. And there's never going to be that high of a frequency that we run into sets. And then, of course, any kind of board texture where the offsuit 2 pairs do exist, naturally, those are going to be ones that are much more connected together. But even something like a Jack 10-5 or something like that, the fact that our opponents, in a lot of cases, maybe can have Jack 10 offsuit. If that's the case, that does actually make a reasonably significant difference, right? So that's always just something to watch out for. The two pairs, and particularly the offsuit two pairs, are going to make a difference there. Broadly, we're just going to keep an eye on these parameters, these concepts. And you've obviously, from the videos, you've seen the concepts related to the positioning of the ranges, right? You've seen this idea of formations. And to simplify it a little bit, as we've over time come to flesh out some of these concepts, and as I've looked more deeply into these things, I think it's very reasonable to just look at multi-way situations, regardless of how many players are in there. You can just look at the pre-flop raiser, the first caller, and then everybody else, right? Because if the raiser is going to be stronger than the first caller is going to be stronger than everybody else, and then everybody behind that, third, fourth, fifth, sixth callers, whatever it is, all of those players are going to have wide passive ranges. And naturally, we ourselves are most often going to be the pre-flop raiser when we're in a multi-way pot. We're also sometimes going to be the first caller, and ideally, we should not be the second caller or any kind of caller beyond that very often, right? It should be pretty rare. There shouldn't be too many spots there, because there's going to be tons of situations where if it goes raise and call ahead of us, we're just going to be in a really good spot to squeeze, to 3-bet, to apply a lot of pressure and focus on picking up that dead money, right? So this is the overall structure. And this is the most common formation that we're going to see here. We're going to see this 3-1-2. So we're going to see the big blind being first to act, or in a cash game environment, it can be the straddle. Whoever is the player that's putting in the most blind money pre-flop is going to be first to act. And then you've got an out of position raiser or a player in the middle here who is maybe an early position opener, something like that. And then a caller who is third to act here. So this is the most important multi-way formation. It's the most common one by quite a distance. And it's going to happen especially in circumstances where you've got a player in the big blind that is particularly prone to just not wanting to fold. And from the sound of the games that you're playing in, it sounds like there's quite a few players in those games that are in that category. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just going to ask, because quite often it'll go raise, call.
Yeah.
So in that case, would it be 3-1-2-3 is the similar?
Yeah. Yeah. I would say but basically you've got like the 3 is first to act on the flop. And then, yeah, if you've got another caller in there, technically it is 3-1-2-3, because you've got a weak range acting first, and then you've also got a weak range acting last. So it is, you can technically, you can look at it as a different formation. That does matter to some degree, but it's going to be useful to treat it fairly similarly to the 3-1-2, simply because that, let's say the button was in the pot here with a wide range as well. It does vary depending on exactly how wide that range is, but the presence of that extra player here with a fairly wide range isn't going to matter a ton. It's only going to matter a little bit because their range isn't going to be that wide. And in particular, the only thing that it's really going to do is it's going to mean that, for example, we're going to be second to act of 4 instead of second to act of 3. So there's going to be 2 players who have position on us. That's why it slows us down a little bit. Now, if the additional caller was in the small blind, so, it goes like raise, call, and then both blinds call to create like a 3-3-1-2. That is actually going to be even better for us, because now there's 2 players out of position against us, both of whom have pretty wide, kind of trashy ranges, right? So naturally, that scenario is actually even better than just a kind of regular scenario like this. So we are certainly going to find a lot of benefit in, I think, studying this type of situation. In particular, like I say, when you've got players that are really splashy in the big blind, the general sort of rule of thumb here in this situation is that the wider the third place range gets, the more c-betting you're going to be able to do, because there's going to be more and more trashy hands in those ranges, or in this range particularly, that are going to be forced to fold. And then the same is true to some extent with the second place range. Obviously, if the second place range was wider than usual, then you would get to do a bit more c-betting there as well. But the key thing here is that this player has position on you. So them being a little bit wider than normal is it's not going to give you that much room to increase your frequencies here. But when the big blind is excessively wide, if they're like calling three ways with a bunch of trashy offsuit stuff that shouldn't be calling and various things like that, does certainly give you more leeway to take more aggressive c-bet strategies, because they have so many more offsuit hands that are just going to check fold flops at a pretty high rate. And that's going to naturally mean that there are going to be more incentives for you to use a lot of small bet, high frequency kind of strategies. So it's a good thing to keep in mind here, that the number 3 range being really wide, or being even wider than it's supposed to be, does give us more flexibility. Now, if it was a good player here, and you, for example, are going to be in a situation where they actually have a reasonably tight range, like they should do here, like a kind of well-constructed range, let's say, then that would obviously have the inverse impact, and it would slow you down quite a bit, because the advantage that you get from being in position against them is reduced by the fact that their range is a little bit on the tighter side. So there's going to be a natural give and take there, depending on what the ranges are going to look like in this sort of a situation. Now, the next thing that I want to speak about a little bit here is what we're doing as the in position second place range here, right? Because this is a spot that players tend to, I think before we had the ability to do some multi-way solving in the last couple of years, it was not really, this wasn't a particularly well understood concept, but there are going to be some spots where if we're the caller here and we're facing a bet from, let's say, the pre-flop raiser, we're facing a c-bet, we are going to have certain situations where we have no reason to raise that bet. Do we just play call or fold against that bet? And then there are going to be other situations where we are definitely going to have some raises, and we don't have to play as passively. And what it comes down to is the strength of the range that is left to act behind us. So if we were to, for example, be in a situation like this where it was, we were the second place range and there was another range behind us that's relatively strong on a certain board, then we might want to just play call or fold against the pre-flop raisers c-bet. But when the player who's behind us left to act is the big blind, if they're pretty wide, then they aren't going to be, we're not particularly scared of them, basically. We're not particularly worried about that range. And it's completely fine for us to have some hands that raise against the under the gun player, and we're okay with just shutting the big blind out of the pot at a fairly high frequency there, right? Now, where that's going to change, and we'll talk about certain different formations in a minute, but where that's going to change is when we happen to be the third place range here. Because when we're the third place range, sometimes, it's going to go like first place bets and second place folds, and now we're just playing heads up against the first place player, in which case our strategy is just going to be a slightly tighter version of what it would be if it was a regular heads up flop spot. But sometimes it's going to go, the first player checks, first place range checks, and the number 2 player bets. And so we're the big blind here, and we're facing a bet from the cutoff, and we still have the under the gun player left to act behind us. That is a great example of a situation where in most cases, we should never raise anything, because that strong range being left to act behind us, even if it's not going to be check raising that often, the fact that it's the under the gun player that's left to act behind, and they naturally are going to have more hands in their range that can continue in this situation, whether by calling or by raising, it's going to incentivize us to just play call or fold, because all of our strong hands, they want to create a circumstance where this range is potentially going to raise sometimes, right? If we flop a set or something, we want the original raiser to come back with a check raise. And then with the rest of our range, the not so strong stuff, we don't have much incentive to reopen the action when there's still a player behind us that has a range that can be fairly strong, right? So in this particular case, when we're the number 3 range here, if the number 1 range is still left to act behind us, we don't really want to do any raising. And this whole dynamic can essentially be simplified by saying that if we are facing a bet and there's a player left to act behind us who is basically a higher ranking than we are, right? So if we're the number 2 range and the number 1 range is still left behind us, or if we're the number 3 range and the number 2 is still behind us, or the number 1 is still behind us, or if it's 6 ways and we're the number 2 and then number 3 finds like a weird bet or something and number 1 is still behind or whatever it is, if there's a player whose range is stronger than us who is behind us, we probably shouldn't raise anything. And that's a pretty decent rule of thumb that's applicable for a lot of situations. So that's a good starting point. That was something that, you know, between making the original courses and now, it's a good principle that I fleshed out by looking at some more multi-way sims. And then the second thing is that if it goes bet call, so if we're in the big blind and it goes bet call, or if somehow if like we're in the cutoff and it goes donk bet call, for example, then in that instance, there will be quite a lot of spots where we have to think carefully about which hands might raise and which hands might call, because quite often some hands now have the ability to, like, some certain specific hands in some spots will be able to get one player to fold a better hand and then get the other player to call a worse hand sometimes. So you have all of these factors of low frequency things that can happen. And so these merging factors, these factors of I can bluff out a pair, but I can also get called by a draw, stuff like that starts to become very relevant. And there are a lot of situations where if it does go under the gun bets, cut off calls, and we're in the big blind, there's actually quite a few spots where we can just play raise or fold and we play no calls at all. And part of the reason for that is because going to the turn and having to play the turn and river out of position 3 ways, especially at deep stacks, quite often that's pretty unfavorable for us. So there will be quite a few situations where if it goes bet call, we're just going to follow that up by playing raise or fold. And we don't have to worry too much about having an overcall range here and going to the turn 3 ways or anything like that. There are some nuances in terms of which board textures favor which option and things like that. But these are a couple of the principles that we understand a bit now that we have more ability to flesh out these sims and these spots. So there's that idea of not raising if there's a player behind you who has a stronger range than you. And then there's that idea of playing raise or fold if it goes bet call, because that now allows you to have certain hands that can get better to fold and get worse to call, right? So everything shifts a bit more into the direction of there's a lot more incentive to win some of that dead money and less incentive to continue to the next street out of position 3 ways. Now, if we were last to act in position and it was bet call, so if it was three ways here, we're on the button and under the gun bets, cut off calls. Now we don't really need to play raise or fold because now we're going to the next street in position. So that's a pretty big deal. That's a pretty big favorable factor there. So that doesn't quite apply in that case. But in general, this formation, there's a lot of stuff that we know now that we didn't know before. Now, this one is quite an interesting formation because we are going to find ourselves in this spot sometimes, but we're really only going to be in this spot as the number 2 when we're in the small blind. And when we're the number 1, naturally, we can open from any position, but the only realistic way that this can really happen is if we raise and both blinds call. And obviously, in a straddle game, it would be if any 2 of the 3 blinds call. People shouldn't be calling from the small blind in a straddle game very often, but if any 2 of the 3 blinds did call, we would naturally go to the flop in position 3 ways, which would be a very good spot for us. And these spots are generally much better than people think. Like, we can play these spots quite aggressively, probably not even that differently from heads up, because the ability to have position on both players here allows us to leverage them against each other in a lot of ways. We're doing a lot of betting flops. And then because the small blind has to think about the big blind being left to act behind, the small blind can't get too out of line against us. And then the big blind just has a wide range. And then, of course, sometimes the small blind calls, so the big blind folds a lot as well. So both players have to worry about the other one. And we're in a very good spot because we're in position. So when we're the last to act as the number 1 here, It's really good. And it does allow us to play quite aggressively and to take advantage of a lot of good spots. Now, the other way in which this spot can happen is if we have limpers involved, right? So if a player limps under the gun, somebody else limps in middle position, we open the button or we raise the button and they both call, that's creating a 2-3-1 because the original limper has a slightly tighter range than the second limper. And then we obviously have a much stronger range. Do you feel like those types of limp spots happen a lot in your games as well?
Yeah, constantly.
Okay. So
Every end.
that's a good type of spot to analyze, right? Or it's a good type of spot to get comfortable with how we're going to navigate it. Now, if we're thinking about what types of board textures we're going to attack in a formation like that, let's say when we do have two limpers and we raise, or when we raise and both blinds call, the thing about board texture interactions is that if we're assuming that most of our opponents are not going to be particularly well balanced with their pre-flop ranges, which I think is a pretty logical assumption to make, then essentially what's going to happen is that every trend that we observe from heads up is going to be amplified when we're multi-way. So the board textures that are bad for us heads up are going to be very bad for us once we're going 3 or 4 ways. But the board textures that are good for us heads up are going to be very good for us when we go 3 or 4 ways, particularly if it's two limpers and we raise and we get called and the flop comes like ace, even basically any ace high, but like specifically if it comes like 2 broadways, double Broadway, something like that, like king, queen, 5 or something. There's so much betting you can do there. You can just bomb with huge portions of your range there because your opponents just have almost nothing that's even vaguely strong. Very few hands that can play for stacks. So you really get to shovel in a lot of chips there on those types of textures. You get to really apply a ton of pressure, just take down a ton of pots with bluffs. So what you kind of want to keep in mind is that idea that board texture or board coverage, if your opponent's making even a little bit of a mistake with how their range is constructed or what types of hands they have in their range, which most people will be making mistakes in that way. If you're up against 2 or 3 opponents and all 3 of them are making a mistake because when they limp call, they just mostly have like low card suited hands or low pocket pairs, right? Which is a common thing. That can easily be the case. Then what's going to happen is if you get into that situation where they do limp and you arrive at a flop in a limped pot and you raise and they all call, if the flop is all low cards, it's going to smash those players' ranges so hard that you're going to be able to do very little betting at all. And it might make sense to just check everything because you just are at a massive disadvantage against those 3 players. But then the flip side is going to be true that where any kind of high card board at all, if those players are all very low card dense, any kind of high card board at all, you can just go absolutely nuts and just range bet. You can range bet 6 ways in some spots because if your opponents are just completely full of garbage on some double high card board, then they just can't defend. Even if you're up against 5 or 6 players, if they just have way too many trashy hands, you can still play aggressively when you have that last to act factor in your favor. So be aware of board coverage in these formations. And if you do see those ranges that are very condensed towards specific parts of the deck, be mindful of those board textures and then attack the other ones, basically. And then finally, we have the 1, 2, 3. Now, this is a weird one because this does not, like, the worse your opponents are, the less often this is going to happen. And that's not because the ranges of the players in position are tighter. It's simply because the 4th player in the big blind is not going to fold. If this guy is really passive, he ain't going to fold anything like even like vaguely playable here. So you're going to get very few situations here where it actually goes raise, call, and then everybody else folds. And most of the time, this is just going to end up leading to raise, call, and the big blind flicks it in, right? Or something like that. So this is a less important formation, but if it does happen, it is a much less aggressive one. It's a formation where we basically don't really ever get to use bigger bets here. We don't really have much flexibility or much option to try to take advantage of betting larger or to try to be expansive or a bit more creative with our strategy. Because being first to act out of position against two relatively robust ranges, the best that's really going to happen is we're going to get a board texture that maybe we do get to bet small at a reasonable frequency and just target some of those pocket pair hands. But we're not really going to get too many boards that we're going to range bet, or not really going to get any boards that we're going to range bet if we're first to act out of multiple players. And then if we are facing a bad board, then clearly these are spots where we have an incentive to, to just check everything. The one thing I didn't mention about the previous type, just quickly here, is that idea of not having a raising range against the c-bet. That doesn't really apply in this particular situation, because the only player who's most likely to have to worry about facing a c-bet with a player left to act behind them is the small blind. And the big blind has a weak enough range that in most cases, the small blind can have a raising range here without having to care too much about what the big blind does. The big blind isn't going to have a scary kind of a range behind them here. But this formation is a little bit different, because sometimes you're going to have some weird stuff happen. Sometimes you're going to have spots where the under the gun player checks, and then let's say the hijack bets, and then we're on the button. And in that instance, we are the number 3 facing a bet from the number 2, and the number 1 is still behind. So in that case, we would probably play no raises, right? If in the opposite case, we are the under the gun player and it checks to the button and the button bets, in that case, being the under the gun player, we might still be okay with having some raises, because the player who's left behind us has a weaker range than we do. The hijack here has to obey the fact that our range is pretty strong. So we might raise there even though we have a player with a decently strong range left behind us. So there's just all sorts of different considerations. And then you've got probably the other one that would be relevant here would be, I'm trying to think of what would be the best example. Yeah, you're going to have spots like under the gun checks, hijack bets, and then button calls. And now under the gun, again, is faced with maybe not necessarily call or fold like it was in the big blind, but they're going to do, raise or fold, but they're going to do a lot of raising here if it goes bet call, because they're up against two ranges that are both weaker than theirs is overall. And they also don't want to have the necessity of playing out of position on turn and river first to act. And they also there's a little bit of dead money out there to take down as well. And then in a similar sort of a way, the kind of probably the weirdest spot that can happen here is it goes check, and then the button bets, and then under the gun calls. And now we're like in the hijack, and there's a bet from the weakest range and a call from the strongest range. This is a very weird spot to be in. I think we are usually okay with having some calls there, because the upside of that is that we still have position against the stronger range, right? We still have position against the number 1 range across the turn and river, which is really good. And the only player that has position on us is the one that has a weaker range than we do. So it's not an inherently negative spot to call there when it goes bet call from button and under the gun. But it also is a really nice spot. In particular, if you think the under the gun player is never going to do anything trappy here, if you think that when the button bets and under the gun calls, under the gun just never has anything particularly strong and they're never slow playing anything, that's a really good opportunity to come in with a raise here and apply a lot of pressure to that button range and be confident that you can capture this dead money at a pretty high rate here. So one of the keys to understanding these situations is just recognizing how strong overall each of the ranges is, and then understanding that if we are up against a range that is overall weaker than ours or overall stronger than ours, that's going to influence the way that we play. And then the ability to put pressure on somebody that puts money in the pot passively, particularly here, probably the best spot to put pressure on in this situation is if we check as under the gun, hijack bets, and then button calls. We know that the button is the weakest of the 3 ranges. And even though theoretically they should be just playing call or fold here and they should play no raises, in practice, they may actually raise their strongest hands. So when they do call, they're even more capped. They're even more vulnerable here to our aggression. So when it goes bet call, we really only have to worry about the hijack. This is basically just dead money here from the button. And we can really apply a ton of pressure with raises in this spot. I think it's a really good situation to be in when we're dealing with these multi-way spots. And people, for the most part, are just drastically under raising in situations like this. Like they're nowhere close to like reaching the right kind of aggression frequencies. That is a big thing. And something else I forgot to mention, actually going back to situations, any situation where we're out of position and we are facing some kind of aggression. What's important about these situations multi-way compared to heads up is that sometimes there are things that we can do in multi-way pots that we wouldn't usually bother doing in heads up. So for example, in a heads up pot, if we get to a flop with a very dynamic flop where there's a flush draw and a straight draw or something, and we have a combo draw and we just check shove all in for like infinite chips. We just check shove all in for 5 times the pot or something, right? Normally we would never bother doing that because most of our opponent's hands don't have tough decisions against that when we do it, right? It's hard to balance our range. It's hard to make them indifferent. But in a multi-way pot, it is sometimes the case that doing something like taking a combo draw and just check shoving for infinite can actually be really good because there's now more than one player who can be in a tough spot against that. And you can get some circumstances where the presence of the third player forces the second player to make bigger folds and things like that. So let's say you check shove with a draw from the big blind. Let's say something like this, right? So like under the gun bets, cut off calls, we have a combo draw and we just shove for a lot more chips than we usually would heads up. In a heads up pot, the under the gun player has a pretty simple call or fold decision. In a multi-way pot, they still have a call or fold decision in most cases, depending on stacks, but they have to worry about the cutoff potentially having some traps behind them. So we actually get more folds from under the gun than what we would do heads up. And then with the cutoff, obviously they still have to have a hand that's strong enough to call us, and they may not have that many of those hands in their range. So it's actually completely okay and reasonable to take some pretty outlandish lines in multi-way pots when you have those types of, like the best hand candidates to do this with are like a weak pair plus a draw. So like bottom pair plus flush draw type hands are really good for that. Let's say also just like combo draws, obviously pair plus open ender on certain boards are really good for that.
Blocking their 2 pair, ideally.
Yeah, exactly. Blocking 2 pair, blocking sets, like all that sort of stuff. You don't generally want to do it with a ton of completely unpaired draws. But if it's like a really high equity unpaired draw, like I'm trying to think of the spot that I did it in. Actually, I had a pair in that spot, so it doesn't count. But if you have a nut flush draw plus a gut shot plus ace high or whatever, like you just have all kinds of equity there. That can be really good. I did it in a WSOP spot over the summer with, it was a pretty big multi-way pot, but it was like I had 6-5, or was it 6-4? I had 6-5 of diamonds in the big blind, and it went under the gun open call. So you went 3 ways to the flop, and I flopped like, I think the flop was 5-3 deuce with 2 diamonds. So I had a pair plus, no, it was 5-3 deuce with 1 diamond. So I had a pair plus a straight draw, and it checked to the in position player. I called because the pre-flop raiser was still left to act behind me. And then pre-flop raiser overcalled. And then turn was the king of diamonds. And it was now 2 spades and 2 diamonds. So it was 6-3 deuce, or 5-3 deuce, king, spade, diamond, diamond. So I had a pair, gut shot, and a flush draw. And I checked, pre-flop raiser checked, in position bet again. And I was in a weird spot where the in position player was slightly shorter than the pre-flop raiser, and I was about as deep as the pre-flop raiser. So I had a deeper effective stack against the pre-flop raiser than I did against the caller. And so I ended up just check shoving with pair, gut shot, plus flush draw. And I ran it afterwards, and this was like, I basically nailed like the perfect play, even though it was a really big shove. And the crazy thing about it was the hand that ended up calling off and busting me was he had king 10 of spades, the under the gun player. So he actually had check called a flush draw on the flop and then turned top pair, but he tanked quite a long time with it. Like my check shove was big enough that he actually had top pair plus a flush draw, but it put him in a tough spot with that hand. And I like I said, I ran it afterwards, and his hand is pretty difficult to fold, but his hand is not as trivial of a call as it seems like it is, because with one card to come, top pair plus a flush draw, in a situation where sometimes I can have stuff like a straight where only his flush draw is live, things like that. It put him in a very tough spot. And I didn't bink my flush draw, ended up busting, but it was a spot where even just that spot taught me a lot, because I played it that way in game, not being 100% sure that this was good. It was like, it was like, this is a big shove, and I think this makes sense, but I'm not 100% sure. And then I ran it, and it was like, it told me like exactly, I'm supposed to check jam that turn with all of my like weak pair combo draws. So any pair plus spades, any pair plus diamonds, I'm supposed to check jam. A lot of pair plus open ender. So like 4-3, 5-4, I was supposed to jam. And I was also supposed to jam any low card two pair, and also any straight without a diamond or a spade. So if I had a straight that was just clubs or hearts, I'm supposed to jam that as well. So it was a very clear range of vulnerable value hands. So like value hands that don't really want to see a river and would just prefer to get it in now. And then high equity draws and high equity like combo stuff. And that was it. There was no need to have any super nutted stuff in there, because when you're shoving all in, your opponent still just has to have enough equity to call, right? They can't exploit you with hands that don't have enough equity. So that happens a lot in multi-way. And this one hand taught me a bunch, because I ran it afterwards, and it was like, yeah, this is exactly what you should do here. You should check shove for a large amount, because doing it with a range of two pairs and a lot of high equity draw stuff actually puts both players in a lot of very tough spots. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
I find I struggle because the SPR gets so low. For example, if I was in the small blind and it goes open call, where my squeeze is till 75.
Yeah.
And then they both call. So we're going to a flop of 20 or whatever.
Yeah.
And we're playing 500 effective at the start. And then 400, I check, and then they'll bet like really big. Like it'll be $100 bet. And then I just have to fold a lot of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a couple of
as much fold equity to have as many bluff.
I think there's a couple of ways that you can manipulate that a little bit, though. I think the first thing is that even if you're out of position, if your opponents are like really not very observant, what you can do is, if you like, there might be quite a lot of hands that they would have where if you checked, they would bet, 100 or something. They would bet like half pot. But if you bet like $25, they'll just call.
Yeah, 100%.
And then they'll very much give away the strength of their range by doing that, because they're never calling with anything trappy. So if you just take these almost like absurdly small range bet lines, where it's like a check with a little bit of fold equity, and then you're also having the side effect of it's not information, but it's that when your opponent continues against that size, they are doing it with a very capped range, and you're using a size that kind of forces them, or it makes them feel like they can't afford to not raise when they have strong hands.
Yeah, I've kind of really well much at the game I'm playing at the moment. In another game, that 10% seems to work against 3 or 4 players. It works fantastic.
Yeah. And it can be great in position, because it just frustrates people so much. You get them like calling even out of position, like they face 10% and they don't have a hand that actually is going to have much equity, but they just feel like they can't even fold anything to 10%. And so they actually put more money, they actually underfold. They put more money in the pot with hands that shouldn't even put money in the pot at all.
Yeah. So, and mind that when those people up the front call too wide, you'll see people behind fold too much because of the
Yeah,
people.
exactly. You get like absurd stuff where like you bet 10% and then the under the gun player will call with like jack high nothing. And then
Yeah.
the middle position guy will be like, oh, already went bet and call. The middle position guy will fold bottom pair. And
Yeah,
it's just,
exactly.
it's the dream scenario where you get the guy, you get the guy with trash to call and the guy with an actual hand to fold. So yeah, that certainly is a thing. And then there's also just the element of when you have these low SPR situations, it is in the same vein as I mentioned the check shoves and stuff a minute ago. It's completely fine to just jam the flop sometimes, particularly on not so much the like the ace high or the king high textures or anything like that, where a lot of your strong hands are very strong to the point where they don't really need a lot of protection. But if it comes, I don't know, 10, 10, 8, 3 with two spades and you have an overpair, especially an overpair with no spade, it's completely fine to just rip the flop for 2x pot and just expect that you're now putting a lot of those draws in a tough spot. It's the opposite of what I just mentioned, where your opponent has a value hand and you're shoving a draw and putting them in a tough spot because you do also have some value hands. It's the inverse. It's you have a value hand and they have a draw a lot of the time. And now you're putting them in a tough spot because you could easily have a better draw and they know they have plenty of equity, but they don't know exactly how much equity they have. And so if it comes 10, 8, 3, two spades, and you just have like red queens and you shove, when they have, I don't know, I mean, they're not going to fold the nut flush draw or whatever, but if they have like king, queen of the suit, then they're not going to feel like they can fold. But if they face 2x pot, they probably have a lot less equity than they think they do against your
Yeah.
actual range. And similarly, they might even look at like jack nine. They might look at like jack nine with a backdoor on that board and be like, I guess I got a call. And so it just ends up with a lot of punts. And you can even have like absurd spots where you just jam with a flush draw on that board and you get called by a worse flush draw. Or
Yeah.
you can get called by a worse flush draw and get a pair to fold. Like hands that you're flipping against will fold and hands that you're crushing will call. So there's a lot to be said there for just shoving the flop or even splitting the difference and going with 2E geometric strategy, where you kind of bet half pot on the flop with the assumption that most of the time you're going to shove the turn, or at least you're going to shove a good number of turns. That's pretty good on like low card board textures where there's not necessarily a lot of draws on the board right now, but the turn can bring a draw quite easily. So I'm thinking like 9-5-4 or something. If it's 9-5-4, you can bet 2E on the flop. And then when the turn's like a 10, a jack, even a queen, an 8, a 7, like technically there's a couple of straights that complete sometimes there. But mostly those turn cards are going to bring a lot of like pair plus gut shot type hands on the turn. They're going to bring a lot of open-ender type hands. And it's going to be a really good opportunity for you to take a lot of your value hands and just shove the turn and put a lot of villains' hands in really tough spots on the turn there as well. So
Yep.
there's a lot to be said for those 2E strategies from out of position. And then also you can use that 10% as well. Like I say, that particularly on the very dry static textures, if the flop is paired or whatever, like if you just bet 10% on a paired flop, that's a really nice sort of way to ensure that your opponents are probably going to overfold quite substantially because they're going to have a lot of backdoor hands that probably should call against 10% on a paired flop, but they just think we're four ways. How can I call with the backdoor on the flop? And in reality, they're not supposed to fold them. So there's a lot to be said for that as an approach as well. But it sounds like you're in the right direction as far as how you're setting up for these situations. So it just becomes a question of refining some of the specifics and hand selection and stuff like that. But the good news is you're playing in a lot of games that are soft enough that it's not going to be difficult for you to get away with more or less choosing your strategy according to your hand, as long as your opponent is aware that there's multiple possible interpretations of the action you're taking. As long as they think you can have value when you bluff, and as long as they think you can be bluffing when you have value, you can do whatever you want. So this is the four-handed example, which we touched on some bits and pieces of it, but a lot of the principles are very similar. And for the most part, you can refer to this in this way: if it's a 2-3-1-2, if the second and third place ranges are the same or they're very similar, or if the small blinds range is similar to the cutoffs range here, for example. You could also call it You could add a 4 in there. So if you think that for example, the big blind is considerably wider than the small blind or the cutoff, then you might want to be specific and say that big blind is the 4th range here. So you might want to definitively put them at the bottom. Or honestly, it's not even a bad thing if you think all of these ranges are pretty much the same. You could just call this like a 2-2-1-2. Like you could just put them all in second place if they're basically the same range. So you can be pretty flexible with how you refer to these things, what sort of positions you allocate to each player in terms of overall strength of range. Because you're not going to really be able to go too much further than that when it comes to live poker. Like you're not really going to broadly be able to understand anything about like how often are they actually calling with this hand versus that hand. What's the actual frequency they're doing this or that. You're just going to have a general sense of, oh, this guy just never flats strong hands. Like this guy flats way too wide. This guy's just super passive. This guy's on tilt right now, like all this sort of stuff. Just generalizing in that way is usually pretty helpful. And the same, of course, is true for 5 players. Same is true for 6 players. So one way or the other here, we can use these concepts pretty well. Now, for the last 10 minutes or so, I just want to make sure that we touch on ideas related to how we're actually selecting hands to go into our betting strategies here. Because there's obviously a couple things from the video series, the video courses that we can touch on, we can revisit that hopefully are pretty relevant and pretty helpful there. So talk me through a little bit. Let's say we put you in, let's go back to a 3-1-2 scenario here. Some kind of a basic sort of 3-1-2 scenario. And let's say we've decided that on a specific flop, we're going to go with a 1/3 pot size as our flop size. Let's say we've just decided that. What sort of things are you going to be considering when you're trying to evaluate which hands you're actually going to bet? What properties are you going to be looking for in hands there?
As far as, so it'll be, I would just check more as the kicker, assuming one pair, like we'll probably have to bet 2 pair and bet. With 1 pair, just checking fairly high up, say it's king 8 deuce or whatever. Like I'd probably check up to king 9 and maybe even king 10 and then bet the rest. And then with backdoor, I would like to bet some backdoor stuff. Or I also tend to, this might be a complete mistake, but if I am deciding that I'm going to have a huge range advantage here and I'm going to have to barrel off, I would rather pick like a no backdoor flush. So like an ace jack of spades on club diamond heart instead of trying to navigate while bluffing and then picking up a flush draw and then it's weird out of position.
Okay, sure. I see what you mean. I think the one thing that I would probably pick up on there is just you framed it in terms of, I'm going to have to barrel off here. I think it's important to recognize that we never have to barrel off. We never have to do anything. And planning, this is something I notice from people all the time. It's trying to plan the whole hand on the flop because it's easier. It feels like more comfortable to make your flop decision aggressively if you feel like you have a good understanding of what you're going to do on the turn. But the problem is there's 1,600 and something different turns or more than that. I can't remember the exact number, but it's whatever it is. There's 1,600 different runouts. There's 47 different turns and 46 different rivers for every different scenario, right? And there aren't going to be that many board textures where we can chunk large numbers of turns together and employ the same strategy. So the way that I would generally look at it is we want to look for incentives and properties, right? So we want to look for the incentive of different hands. If our hand has the incentive our hand is going to have the incentive to bet if it can very obviously benefit from getting calls from a lot of worse hands, or if we have the ability to get folds from a lot of better hands, but still have equity if we get called, obviously. But the properties of those hands are going to be very interesting because the more, and this is where I think we can maybe make a bit of a tweak to your approach there, the more multi-way we go, the less we want to be sensitive to the rank of our hand or the rank of our kicker, and the more we want to be sensitive to the suit. So the shift that I would make from those approaches that you mentioned on the flop there is that you mentioned we probably have to bet most of the 2 pair and better. I think that it's worthwhile to recognize that when your opponents continue, let's say it's a rainbow flop, right? King 8 deuce rainbow is the example you gave. When your opponents continue on the flop, they are more likely on average to put more money in when they have backdoors themselves, right? They're either going to call flop more often, or they're going to call flop and then call turn or something like that. So in general, the thing about multi-way is that the hands that, when you have value hands that are blocking backdoors or blocking draws in general, you're actually a bit less likely to get action.
Yeah, yep, I get it.
So in particular, if you wanted to take something like King 8 deuce, depending on the nature of the exact suits that are on the flop, you might say, if I have pocket eights, let's say the flop is king of spades, 8 of hearts, 3 of diamonds, right? So it's spade, heart, diamond. If you have pocket eights with a club and a spade, or a club and a diamond, then because you have a club in your hand, there's additional combos of an 8 with a backdoor that can call you. But when you specifically have pocket eights with a spade and a diamond, you're blocking 2 of the combos, or you're blocking both of the combos of 8x with a backdoor. You see what I mean?
Yeah. And if you extend on that, then I think what I'm doing is doing like when you get to the river, you don't want to bluff the flush draws because then they have block. I'm doing that too early rather than save for that to the river. Like I should be trying to backdoors now rather than unblocking them at the end.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to front load all the way to the river. Like you don't have to take your river strat and like front load it all the way on the flop, I guess is what I mean.
Yeah.
So if because there's certain combos of certain hands that are going to get more value, certain combos that are going to get less value. So when you have a value hand on the flop, when you're betting a hand that is definitively the reason we're betting is to get action from worse, you want to unblock as much of that worse as possible. And so let's say another example there would be king 8 on that flop, right? If you have king 8 on the flop, king 8 suited, obviously. The king is the spade, the 8 is a heart. So any king X of spades is already blocked. King 8x of hearts is already blocked. But if you're trying to get value from those hands on that board, the combos of king X that are going to give you the most value, it's going to be king X of hearts and king X of diamonds. So if you have king 8 of hearts or diamonds, it's a little bit harder for you to win a big pot against the king because those kings with a backdoor are blocked by your hand. But if you have king 8 of clubs, that's perfect. If you have king 8 of clubs, none of the backdoors are blocked. So in that instance, when you specifically have king 8 of clubs is the best hand, the best one to have. It's the one you should definitely bet, right? If you have the other combo of king 8 that is possible, which is king 8 of diamonds, you have king 8 with a backdoor, which means you are now blocking not only the king X of diamonds combos, but also the 8x of diamonds combos that you would otherwise be trying to get value from. So in that instance, of those 2 combos of king 8, instead of just saying, I would bet all my 2 pair here, I would bet the king 8 of clubs and check the king 8 of diamonds. Does that make sense? So it's just a general logic here that obviously if you plug it into the solver's going to do a lot of mixing, but do it this way according to suits because no one's ever going to figure this out, but it is reasonable logic that makes sense here. And then with bluffs, it just works in the inverse way. With bluffs, if you have, let's say it comes king 8 deuce and you have ace deuce suited, right? There's 3 combos of ace deuce suited there. If the deuce is a diamond, you can't have the ace deuce of diamonds. So you got spades, you've got hearts, and you got clubs. Now, if you have ace deuce of clubs, you are opening up every possible backdoor combo that's going to continue, which you don't want. So ace deuce of clubs is a much worse hand to bluff with.
Yeah,
ace deuce with a backdoor, much better. And especially even if you have an 8 here, having an 8 there is nice because when you have an 8, your kicker is going to matter, obviously. And let's say you have the weakest 8 that you can have, which is like 8-7 of something, right? 8-7 of spades, 8-7 of heart, the 8 of hearts is on the board. So 8-7 of spades, 8-7 of diamonds, 8-7 of clubs are the 3 options that you have. 8-7 of clubs, depending on the exact nature of the spot, obviously, when you have 8-7 of clubs, you probably won't be able to get very many better 8s to fold, because the only 8s that are left are going to be ones that have backdoors, mostly suited hands that have backdoors. But if you have 8-7 of spades or 8-7 of diamonds, there's all those 8x of clubs hands out there that could be better than yours that will fold if you bet. If you bet with 8-7 of spades, they can fold even ace-8 of clubs, queen-8 of clubs, something like that. So when you have a middle pair, you want middle pair with a low kicker with a backdoor, or flip side, let's imagine we have ace-8, right? If we have ace-8, there's no better 8s for us to get to fold. We might want to get called by a worse 8 in that instance. So if we have ace-8, which suit do we want to have? If it's spade, heart, diamond.
Clubs.
Exactly. We want to have ace-8 of clubs, because then they can have 8-7 of spades or 8-7 of diamonds, and they actually call with worse. So this is the way that I would encourage looking at some of these spots in multi-way sims or multi-way just situations as a whole, because all of this, it still applies in heads up, but because heads up they're not going to be so suit specific with their responses. They're not going to take one suit and call it, and then the other suit's going to fold it. In multi-way, it does start to work a bit more like that, where they are going to pay attention to, do I also have a backdoor flush draw? If it goes bet, call ahead of them, maybe if they have a backdoor, they're going to call. So that...
It's PLO. That's what it is.
It's exactly what it is. PLO is very much based on this. So the general idea there is you want to shift from being... You don't want to think so much in terms of everything X or better, I'm going to bet. You want to think about selecting the suits such that you can maximize the times that you actually can get value and minimize the times that you run into better, obviously. And then when you're actually bluffing, you can maximize the times that you're able to get folds from better and just have maximum equity if you don't get a fold. So those types of things, backdoor is going to be very relevant. And also, just in a general sense, offsuit hands, like unpaired offsuit hands, generally really don't like bluffing multi-way unless you specifically have obviously some kind of straight draw, flush draw, not flush draw, but like straight draw, gut shot, something like that. For the most part, anything like you mentioned, like ace jack on king 8 deuce, like outside of some of the combos that have the backdoor, particularly if you had ace jack offsuit or if you had ace jack of clubs there, I just wouldn't bet that one. I think that's going to be the type of candidate that doesn't function particularly well. Does that make sense? Cool. So that's just the overall guideline, a few principles, a few general approaches. If you've seen the courses, obviously you'll already have a pretty good idea, but hopefully we can continue shoring that up and just making sure that you have as many tools as possible when you're going into these spots and that you feel confident when you're getting in there.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah.
Cool. Anything else that you wanted to ask about or anything else in your mind?
Oh, don't think so.
Cool. Excellent. All right. We'll go with that. We'll stick with that. And I think next time, I can't remember what the other concepts were that we had listed. Let me just make sure that I can check in on what it was. I think we've got the other two it was 2 sessions on river exploits. So it was like aggressive river exploits. So like exploiting overfolders and exploiting people who like basically any kind of exploit when we're the player who's doing the betting. And then defensive ones, any kind of spot where we're the bluff catching player, all that sort of stuff, just breaking those things down. We'll definitely go through those.
Yeah, awesome.
Cool. All right. Let's go for next week then. I guess we're good for next time.
Yeah.
Sounds good. All right. Talk to you then.
Yeah, fine.
See ya. All right. Bye.